Hello everyone, today we talk about the construction of the moat and protection works in Roman Republican camps. We already made a video specifically dedicated to the Roman Republican camp, its structure, properly the internal organization, how troops were lodged, its functionality for an eventual redeployment, defense of the camp, a sortie, and naturally also the watch duty, the internal discipline, all these things. We will keep talking about that at some levels. Again, today we speak specifically of these protection works around the camp that mostly consisted in the construction of, as we will see, the Agar and the fossa, right? And the latter specifically being the moat, right? Different from a ditch, but properly a deeper, larger work that could vary in dimension and characteristics, as we will see now. In fact, what we have to understand here is that while the Romans were famous for the uniformity, right, and the rigid discipline associated to it in the construction of the camp, that, as you know, was properly the most habitual drill of the Roman legion, that in kind of incarnated the perfect organization of the same army, this replication every single night, at least in enemy territory, or at least where there wasn't any other facility to host the Legionnaires, so properly built all the time. And there was a specific properly drill and also motivational ideology attached to it. We will talk about this at some other point. But the important thing is that every legionnaire knew exactly what to do in this bigger picture in his sector. We'll see it partly today for the construction of the moat and protection works as well. However, as all things military, naturally there wasn't properly anything that was alike, right? As there was no legion that was quite alike to the others. No camp was quite alike to the others, as no legionnaire, no human being is like the other. So different strategical and tactical needs brought to the differentiation of the degree of development of properly the camp construction, depending on the circumstance. And in the case of a simple night marching camp, the first operation consisted of excavating the fossa, that was the moat, right, along the predetermined perimeter. You know that the Romans calculated precisely in there, properly, that they had a team of measures, of mensores, that were properly brought there to calculate the exact space and distances, and was, quite geometrically precise and squared. Here we talk in general about Republican times, so we arrive to the Augustan era more or less. You know that the Romans were said to have adopted camps from the Hellenistic tradition, from Pyrrhus times, and there is probably some truth in there, meaning that surely Hellenistic warfare was the most professional, intensive. In that moment, Rome was exactly on the rise, so it meant with the most advanced military civilization at the time and perfection, what, however, already existed quite surely as a form of encampment on its own, so much that Pyrrhus himself, looking at the Roman host, said, these look a bit too orderly to be barbarians. So right, we are at the beginning of the 3rd century BC. So there are some universal features of a camp, but it was that were somewhat non-original, meaning that every people, more or less, whether they had to encamp, of course there were more kind of semi-nomadic peoples, etc., but that had different characteristics in this field, but more or less of the sedentary populations used camps since a very long time, right? It's just the functionalization, the uniformity, the perfection of this that varied in degree. So the average thing was this moat, right, and a palisade, and the moat known as the fossa could be the simple type. Polybius, that describes this, does not, for Republican times, does not specify the characteristics of such excavation, but the indications provided by works of later period, and in particular from the Munitionibus Castrorum by Hyginus and by Vegetius, also prescribe that it must have been no less than 3 feet, that is 89 centimeters deep, and just 5 feet, 1.48 meters wide, right? As shown in the first picture that I created here, as I don't know whether it's passing by at this very moment, but it's the first, drawing. You can see it with my primitive paint skills, and the Roman legionnaires standing on there. You see, probably here I have, for the sake of simplicity, I adopted the 45 degrees inclination, but properly the slope was steeper, at least in the part where it had to be climbed by the enemy, whereas inside where the Romans had to climb, probably there were either there was less inclination. Here I kind of made it uniform actually, but or having some, it could vary, right? It could be ladders, things like that. As we will see properly, the fortifications could enlarge considerably, being sometimes even up to some properly walls with even some solid, much more solid construction, right? This is the simple type is what would have been on average in an emergency situation, if there was no other way to reinforce the fortification, at least at the moment, right? It had to be, at least according to these later sources, and we don't know much about earlier times, so we have to go by analogy and comparatively. But here we understand the function, right, of these dimensions, which may seem like a few, but you have to think that it's always here the same problem. Here you don't have to think about the individual's physical performance in crossing these this moat, etc. You have to think in collective terms, which is what effectively makes the difference in terms of human groups in combat. That is properly breaking the formation, and it can even a relatively small slope or a ditch, etc., can create serious problems, right? And are even 45 degrees of inclination, believe it's a lot, right? Also, not just because of the crossing, but because you have to fall back, hopefully at some point, at least if the assault fails, and that is a problem. For instance, you have to turn your back in a way or another. Yes, you can't put your shield on your back, but are you sure that at that point you still have your shield on, right? Maybe the Romans have launched a sortie, or you have lost it or destroyed in combat, or there are pila on it and it's unusable. You have literally to run, turning your back to fortifications that can still shoot at you, and that's one of the single most risky and likely also deadly in some circumstances, the things that can happen, right? So it's never a good thing. So in the case of a camp with prospects of longer permanence or in the vicinity of the enemy, the moat could be enlarged considerably, and in particular the width could be increased to 9, 11, 13 or 17 feet with this customary yet always odd measure, at least according to Vegetius 3.8. This aspect is important because when we think about the ancient world, we more or less follow the historiographical taste for the big pitched battle and all the hype concerning that, and therefore essentially normally two armies at some kilometers distance encamped each at that distance in their own fortifications, right? But most warfare in the ancient world, just like in the Middle Ages and up to for many other centuries, was fundamentally revolved around sieges, right, and siege work. And in this instance, we know that it was normal to create fortifications that could be very, very close to the enemy, right? Not just because think about the city or some other massive fortification surround, properly because these larger infrastructures were often fortified by these other types, these lesser kind of fortifications in mostly wood, timber, earth, things like this. And we know by analogy historically that it was important to have such fortifications close, because this way, yes, it was somewhat riskier, but you could still, the advantage provided by the fortification was meant a lot often, right? First of all, to check the enemy at that distance, to know in time what was going on. Also, to properly prevent the enemy to have enough space to deploy and therefore attack in group, in an orderly, collective fashion. That again is what makes the difference, while the individual basically insignificant in this. In between the fortifications, therefore launch an assault, so much that fortifications were usually built at normally a bow shot between one another, right? And they were so close they could literally throw things at each other from the top of the walls, right? And harass each other in that way. Also, in a psychological way, at that point you understand it in terms of pressure than even a physical one. And things could go on, as you know, for months, even years sometimes. So we don't know that much about Roman times, because they are very early, and we are lucky in the first place to know all these things, because for other peoples we know practically nothing. And it's not a coincidence, because the Romans were ahead at this time, already kind of having acquired all the Hellenistic engineering, even perfected, and by the end of the period, for the same reason why they were an empire that could produce the sources for us to know these things, why others wouldn't. But we have to comparatively and diachronically think bigger, and we know in many other military contexts that this was from these contexts that this was pretty much a universal reality, and was valid for the Roman reality as well, which is important, because as a perspective also makes you reconsider what the tactical role of legionnaires could and other people's fighters could be in this context, right? It's not just deep-pitch battle, again, that for which the same ancient historiography was so much keen on and almost obsessed with, but for reasons that are important culturally speaking, and we'll have to discuss at some point, but that this more common reality, in fact, is also interesting to realize, and legionnaires, as we'll see later on during the same construction works, had probably also a different capability of reaction and or adaptation to that work. Consider this, that the Roman legionnaire, in the properest definition you can give of a Roman legionnaire, and the way it's developing here towards especially the later period with the full professionalization of the army, is an assault engineer. As you know, much of the difference that the Roman military made compared to other populations was this incredible additional military engineering capacity of building this astonishing and impressively uniform and solid works in basically any single tactical and strategical situation, right? Caesar is quite eloquent as the main source there, but we know archaeologically that this is the case as well, because of course of the professionalization of the Roman army, the uniformity of the drill, etc., the dramatically intense training, and also the fact that these people were fundamentally all farmers, right? So they were already exposed to that kind of camp life, let's say, as a living. They lived in the nature. They knew how to erect, palisades, dig ditches to live with what they found. So those were the tough kind of average Italic peasantry that, especially at this time, made the bulk of the Roman army, with a motivation that, as you know, was all gradually from winning political and civic rights to win at the end of the day money from loot and farms at discharge, etc. And that's pretty much it. So in Roman camp at this time, depth and width were still discretionary, right? If anything, because every terrain, every ground, every place, every material availability is different, right? And therefore, the tendency from the simple fossa that we were looking about before was to increase normally, and for the development simply of that was the basic. Then eventually you would construct over time. Caesar, for example, near the Aisne River, this is from the Bello Gallico 2.5, had the camp built with a ditch 12 feet deep and 18 feet wide, right? Also, as always, camps were mostly built in, solid, defensible positions, etc. That was the idea, after all, of the whole thing, both from a tactical but also from a properly a strategical point of view. Vegetius 124 also defines fossa tumultuaria, a ditch with a depth of at least 7 feet, that is 2.07 meters, and a width of 9 feet, that is 2.66 meters, with an embankment 3 feet high above the ground level called linea, and fossa legittima, an excavation that reached a depth of 9 feet, that is 2.66 meters, and a width of 12 feet, that is 3.55 meters, with an embankment of at least 4 feet, right? The moat could generally be built according to two types of profile. The V-shaped one, called fossa fastigata, that is a pointed moat with the walls essentially converging downwards. From stratigraphic and archaeological investigations, it emerges that a drainage ditch was almost always built on the bottom of the excavation for just also keeping the slopes more intact, right, to make water flow more freely there, which, however, served as a further insidious obstacle for attackers as well, so much that it was called the ankle breaker. Now, imagine to be attacking such a fortification, so naturally the drainage ditch, it was not, necessarily enough to, for example, prevent the thing would be, flooded, for example, but not only because the main measure, as was to try to fill these ditches before the attack some way, right, with some material of sort. But anyhow, think about the general war conditions of this ground, right? So you run fundamentally in this place. You don't see the bottom of it. Say you're a people that's never fought against a Roman fortification before. You may know about these tricks, but think about in the heat of action, during the assault en masse, with people pressing you, the enemy throwing stuff at you from the front, you can't imagine. You basically have to go down, you have to, first of all, psychologically it's very important, you have to stop because there is this slope and you have to get through that, and it's complicated, as we've seen, especially in terms of, in order to maintain the formation cohesion. In the heat of action, you stick your leg there, you with all your force, you're pressing on it, you remain stuck in the ditch, the ankle breaks, right, and people literally run over you, and imagine all in the meanwhile the enemy throwing stuff at you, so these ditches would be full of corpses of dying people, wounded people all the time, and imagine the complications deriving from this for the attackers, and as we will see, all this moats were properly designed to be functional to the throwing from the palisades as well. So it was all geometrically calculated to provide the best, let's say, nuisance to the enemy and the greatest advantage to the defenders. Now, there would be other considerations to make in general, but it kind of you can get the idea. And there was another type that was the fossa punica, so it took name at least from the Carthaginians. Maybe, I don't know, the Romans learned in turn the art way from them. I don't know what it's called like this, but this was essentially with the outermost wall perpendicular to the ground level, right? So instead than having a slope coming from the enemy side, you have a brusque change in height, and the other one in front is said it's inclined in such a way as to allow full visibility from the ramparts, right? So the purpose was to provide the defenders with an area free from obstacles in which targeting the attackers, right? As well as making the latter's retreat more difficult, because not only when you assault the fortification, you have this sudden the difference in height that you have to literally jump down, because there is no way like the slope to gradually ascend. But when you have to come back, you basically come back down into the bottom of the moat, and then there is this, depending on the size, more or less unclimbable area. It's kind of more complicated too. Naturally, there are pros and cons to this, because still the slope makes this relatively to let's say one of equal side of the regular moat, kind of short, let's say narrower than the simple one, in fact. Whereas the simple one is larger, is wider, right? So there are pros and cons in this regard, but in that regard, also running back and having to at that point jump to try to reach that, to go back when this difference in height. So even properly the impediment of the shield of the weaponry would make the thing more complicated. So the enemy, as we see, the defenders could shoot against the retreating attackers kind of more easily against that wall that was formed, right? So, but this depended on properly how the terrain was built. We know that the Romans were quite inventive also in the way to look at Alesia, right? How diversified and articulated that those circles of defense actually were. There could be spikes, etc. We will see it better also with some. Think about the sudas that could be used in different ways. But in stable fortifications, the two excavations were often carried out in a combined way, right? And up to 3 excavations have been found to protect forts and important installations, as can be seen from the analysis of those ground sections. To profile the different types of excavation and their distance from the palisade were designed to keep the enemy constantly exposed to the trajectory of projectiles and javelins, as we were saying before. You don't want just the enemies to break formation, but fundamentally to prevent their eventual compacting after having crossed the defense. So this is a very logical, simple, and effective principle, right? Imagine these guys that are coming out of the moat, as we've seen individually at that point, and in a heated, considered moment. At that point, they will start popping up one by one, and at that point, it's like they killed the mole game, where you have to concentrate force on the single guys that appear, and therefore it's easier for the archers, the sharpshooters, etc., to throw their darts against that specific guy appearing. And of course there would be other ways. Surely there were enemies even remaining within the moat and trying to recompact there, to come out all at once, things like these. But surely they were complicated, and the objective was properly. And this is to be found universally in warfare, right? I studied these things, for example, for medieval. Medieval city squares were often defended by chains, right? That were not just an anti-cavalry thing, but also literally the man had to climb them. In the moment in which you climb, you kind of have to necessarily go out of the formation. At that point, the enemy would be targeting you with crossbow bolts in the moments in which you individually crossed. So this was kind of the same thing, right? These are universal principles of effectiveness that are not just a matter, here the Romans or the Greeks or the Celts or whatever, but it's properly having, the resources, an engineering culture, a professional that can fundamentally replicate these things all the time uniformly. That will, make the whole thing more effective, because it's present there in the first place, which in war you may not have the time or the resources or the chance to enact, right? And that having permanent professional military is surely a way to ensure more effectively, right? also other peoples had fortifications that worked like that, right? But their military didn't work like that, in the same way. So that's effectively the problem. Now, the excavated earth was accumulated on the inner side of the camp to form a raised embankment, right? The same one that was protecting heading, looming over the moat, known as Agar, at least 3 feet high, consisting of the overlapping of wall clods of earth known as kaispitas, if possible 15 centimeters thick, as kind of a standard measure that evidently the Roman military had somewhat fixed as an average what this cloth could be, and naturally that depends on the terrain. It wouldn't be always the same way, but still. Naturally, the concept here is that, as you understand, the earth that is dug out to create the moat is used to create the embankment and the agar. And there is a convenience, naturally, in having the agar as close to the fossa, because, as we were saying before, you don't want to give the enemy properly the space, the surface available to reform information. So if, like in the drawings that we made here, you have the fossa just with a slope arriving in front of there could be even the agar had to be stable as well, so the foundation had to be solid enough, so maybe it was not just over the fossa, right, properly with the slope of the fossa continuing directly over with the one of the agar. There could be something like that as well. Probably there was a very tiny margin of space, but that would functionally simply duplicate the height that the enemy had to climb in order to assault the top of the agar. And as we were saying just now, these are universal practice that you can't really you see everywhere, right? And they were so effective because again at this time it wasn't much that could be done against these fortifications. The most advanced populations had the Greeks, the Romans had this catapults, torsion engines, things like that. They could, in a sense, those were used mostly actually against properly stone walls and to take out towers, ballistas emplacements, things like that. Against moats and palisades and those things were probably, as the early Middle Ages showed, also probably not convenient in terms of a cost ratio benefit, but it was a problem. But basically for everybody, right? Even for the Romans, right? The procedure was filling the moat under fire, and then bringing in some ladders, or maybe building other embankments, as to maybe reach the top of the enemy palisade, and or to take it down if they had it with, as we've seen, with artillery. But most peoples wouldn't use that. Not even as we've seen, the Romans did it for every single time they had to attack a place, right? So it all depended naturally on the circumstance. That here we are just studying kind of the structure, the engineering side of it, but that you have to imagine in a military context that is dominated by way greater motivations, forces, and objectives than just crossing a moat, right? And that could be done in different ways, and would be done in different ways, but that still provided that kind of obvious advantage to the defender. Was not even a properly let's say a matter of unsurpassability, as we were saying before. It was just given the time, for example, for bringing from inside the defense, enough men to protect that section, because of course if that section had not been manned, this is yet another thing that we have to understand in all warfare, that no fortification is useful by itself. There's no such thing like a fortification that stands there and without garrison and it's unpregnable. If there is no garrison, it's taken immediately. because there is always a way to do it, right? It's just that history shows us maybe the Middle Ages best, but still in this time, already in this time, was practically saying just a few people from a tactical point of view, which may elude from the broader strategical problems. That is, for example, how much you can hold, right? Given supplies or what do you expect in terms of relief forces and so on, can't withstand. But Caesar, again, is a good source of that. Roman legions besieged by swarms of Gauls, for example, resist holding out for a very long time. It was always a matter of, if you man the walls, normally you have enough tactical advantage to fence off enemy attacks. And the problem there, the discriminant, is how much food do you have, how many troops do you have, and how much they are taken out during the defense. And it's almost a mathematical equation, right? But as we know, it's mostly a matter of moral force. That is to say, you must have a motivation to hold on, otherwise, and that's basically the universal logic of a siege in any circumstance. And the Agar could be further strengthened and consolidated with stones, trunks, tree branches, any kind of other material than you think. There were even some mountains in Rome, I don't know, that were created. Maybe this was not the thing, but literally with rubbish, with the earthenware of dishes, of amphoras, of things like that. There is always a way to make it. Any obstacle, any physical object that could provide for some kind of consistency, like a construction material or some characteristics of the terrain associated with it, could do, right? And yeah, timber is something you find, especially in Europe, pretty much everywhere, right? So all the work was eventually leveled to allow naturally the stationing and passage of the sentries over the Agar. Therefore, also a palisade, the ballum, and a parapet, the lorica, could be erected on the external part of the embankment. That was not standard, surprisingly enough. I mean, the palisade would be preferably continuous, but also in there it could be taken down in a way or another. Would be towers or some kind of stronger structures here and there. Normally there were also multiple, multiple kind of fortifications that closing the perimeter, towers and castles at useful distance, that is, to be able to support each other and therefore never leaving a gap in between that could be passed by the enemy without coming under, basically concentrated fire. This we see also in the more elaborated Roman stone fortifications, etc. Think about the great walls, like in every the finest examples of Roman architecture, but military architecture. If the camp was to be of a stable type, the ballum was regularly built with tree trunks, for example, obtained by deforesting the surrounding areas. In the absence of local resources, that could always happen, is that the poles had to be transported on purpose, and this could happen more frequently than, again, here it's not how much wood there is around, but rather, what's the time and what's the available resources already, and do we have this to cope with the enemy strategically? Well, the dictator Cincinnatus, for example, so kind of this part of the Roman sagas, but still, eloquently, this technical datum is provided. Before the departure of the Roman army, ordered the soldiers to prepare 12 poles each, told by Livy 3:27. Now, in the case of marching camps or temporary installations, short hardwood poles called balli or sudas were used in all likelihood, which were carried on the shoulders of the legionnaires during the transfers. Now, Some of these poles, about 1.5 meters high, were found along the Germanic limes and have a double-pointed shape with a characteristic central recess, and their function had to be limited to the constitution of a rudimentary yet effective obstacle, for example by planting them obliquely on the embankment in the direction of the enemy, as it is visible, for example, on some coins, or by joining them in groups of three to form a simple but effective fixed obstacle called the ericius. It would be a hedgehog in Latin, and it's like the Frisian, a bit like the Frisian horse, or tribulus ligneus. This is told by Vegetius 3:8 expressly. And the sudas were quite important properly in the Roman gear, as fundamentally the legionnaires were trained regularly to carry them. The Roman legionnaire was probably, and this tells you a lot about just their psychophysical characteristics, probably the most loaded trooper in gear in military history. We're talking about a maximum weight of 87 kilos. That is, modern military brings, like a single person normally brings 40 kilos, so in part with a trolley, right? These people were the Roman legionnaires, as we've said many times, they conceived themselves properly as something else in terms of to universal standards. They had no other vision but considering themselves legitimately the greatest military machine in the world, and as a consequence they were hyper exalted, psychologically exalted, and physically trained in ways that I think a modern person at this point cannot even approach to understand anymore. Like a person that can carry on a regular basis 87 kilos is a person that basically doesn't even think when he's going to kill somebody, right? They just do. And that's what they were designed to do functionally. Like like the military is designed exclusively to do that. The pure function of the military is not, professional perspectives, acquiring skill. The military for civic right and properly political responsibility is designed exclusively to kill people. Right, that's their function. That's why we create a military. That there is no other, and it's the most functionalized, in fact, aspects, branches of human civilizations, in the sense that in order to do that, either you do what exactly functions, or you get killed in turn. These people were, I don't know, as I often say, it would be very interesting to psychoanalyze a medieval knight. That is another, great, a curiosity of mine as a medievalist. But, a Roman legionnaire, that's also one of those things that I presume, like, it would be from one side too beautiful to know, but from the other too traumatic to know. And it's better that, of course, we will never know by any scratch of imagination what it was like, because there is no way for us mentally to approach that. But just think of what this meant, and just look at what Rome did. Right, these were a city. They created an empire stretching on 3 continents that, basically is the single most important thing that happened in the history of the world. And if you don't have a mentality that, as we know from Roman mythology, the sagas, the culture properly is designed to know that you have properly an evangelic mission to conquer the entire universe, you cannot achieve. Because Clausewitz was right, war is a clash between moral forces. And it's the moral dimension of the Roman Empire where everything has to be explained, not the juridical, the administrative. This is a purely religious and military quality that Rome had for a unique combination in that specific city of Latium that came to expand for reasons that we can't explain now in a political, social, and military sense, in the way that it did to change the history of mankind forever. And this does pass through this. That is, you see, through a Roman camp, you can understand what was the Roman point. they were going to do it in that way. It was fully functionalized in the same way anyway, even when there was no need, because the point was having a military that wouldn't even think whether they had to do something or not, but just to do it. And that's exactly what these people did. And it's difficult to understand, and I excuse myself for the digression, but otherwise this was just a sterile video on like how they built the thing. But if you don't understand why they did so and how the thing was done, it's hard. Of course, there were other civilizations that came close to the more or less the idea of conquering the world was basically the only moral standard existing in the ancient world. There was no people from the smallest tribe to ecumenic empires that didn't think that the ultimate objective of their sole purpose in existence was to conquer whoever was next, right? But it's just that the Romans managed to do it, and the others wouldn't. And if you look at how they did it, well, you can't get to understand what was behind it. Think that we can just approach it, but never fully understand, for better and for worse. Now, the tools used to carry out the excavations are also interesting for a number of reasons. The most characteristic is definitely the dolabra. There is somebody who said the Romans conquered the world with the dolabra. That was a combination of axe and pickaxe, right? That was used in case of needs in combat as well. We know it did happen. The showels, known as palai, the hoes, the ligones, the rakes, rastra, tools for cutting cloths, and a certain number of baskets, of course, known as quali or coffini, to transport the earth. And all the tools were distributed among the legionnaires to be carried on the shoulders or loaded on the mules or on the baggage wagons assigned to the various maniples. Consider that maniples were in use all the time, organically, also in post-Marian times, and that, of course, even after Marius' troops kept using mules and wagons. That is, they were trained to load all the stuff on them by default. It's just that, of course, when you're doing it against the odds in real war, by lightening the legionnaire at that point, it's as if you have the possibility and fundamentally no logistical loss from it, you're going to actually lighten the work of what the legionnaire was trained to do anyway. In fact, Flavius Josephus in early imperial times saying that for a Roman legionnaire, war was just fundamentally training which they spilled a bit of blood and nothing else. And that's exactly the mindset that we were talking about before. So according to the details provided by Polybius, the excavations were carried out simultaneously on all four sides of the camp and divided equally between the Roman legions and the ally of the allies. So we are in Republican times, so as you know, fundamentally, as always, in Roman history, there was never a moment in Roman history in which the Roman legions fought, which Roman citizens were the prevalent element of the army, right? Here in Republican times, the Italic ally were the social contingents were always superior in number to the Romans. And they would, however, as we've seen, share proportionally the work. And usually the allies were entrusted with the construction of the excavations on the sides along which they were encamped. That is basically the porta principalis dextra and the sinistra, while the Romans were responsible for the excavation of the other two sides, that is the Porta Praetoria and the Decumana. So the Romans were given essentially the preferential, like the most important, like the front and the rear, the north-south axis, one per legion. Also in here there was a deep religious meaning, properly in this distribution and primacy of honor for the signs properly that were taken, etc. We have seen it also in the video on how troops were lodged within the same camp, what were properly the ones that entered in combat the earliest and the others would follow, etc. and so on. Now, each side was divided into 2 parts corresponding to the number of maniples in charge. So, if the camp was to be built in enemy territory with the consequent danger of sudden attacks, only a part of the maniples, for example, I don't know, 10 out of 30, was used in the works within the legion, while the other maniples and the cavalry as well were placed outside the perimeter of the field, ready to face possible attacks. This is quite important because, as we were saying before, so the camp was built at the same speed, all without delay, hopefully from all sides, right? By going by the book. So this would uniform even in there properly the capacity of having the entire structure all in one shot. Now, it was at this point, especially in pre-Marian times, Roman cavalry was consistent because of the Allies' participation, properly from a quantitative point of view. That's the best way to, for example, to counterattack an enemy attack. And plus there were other properly the infantry still stationed around the camp to protect it. And to be encamped in areas, as you can imagine, even where the enemy would enact frequent ambushes or things like that, was meant really to be facing enemy attacks basically all along, even during the march, during the setting of the camp. Of course, operations could not stop at that point. Think even about, I don't know, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, or imagine what it could be the early days in the Samnium, etc. When, there were parts of the army were under attack, yes, but, the march had to go on, and then, the various tribunes would tell you what was going on at some point, would arrive to the camp. These armies were quite big. Normally, when the head of the army arrived in the place where the camp for the next night had to be built, normally tail, let's call it like this, was abandoning the previous night's camp. So it was normal to be under attack at some level, especially by all these populations that didn't fight quite in, they wouldn't expose themselves in pitched battles because they would have not stood much chance against the Legionnaires. Harassing, skirmishing, all it was normal. So also the camp was built often under attack, under fire, right? And this, as we were saying before, was normal if you think about how most of these fortifications would be built in siege warfare, where properly for the sake of eventually storming the place, you have to surround it, you have to start gradually build all these embankments around, the ramps, etc., that are always under fire. Look at what the Romans did at Masada, or it was always under fire. And this reason, that's where the assault engineer comes handy, right? Because somebody has to guard him, but basically those who work at the fields are the same Legionnaires, right? That occasionally can, very messed up situations, can also properly fight and work at the same time. So, in the case of a consular army of 2 legions, let's say, in a basic sense, each maniple worked on a front of, so it would be basically 63 meters. It's calculable. Even considering that not all the members of the maniple in charge were properly committed, it appears that on average almost 2 men worked on 1 meter of the excavation perimeter, the face of it. So when the enemy was close, the legionnaires in charge worked in combat gear. There's a debate, probably here without we don't know how it happened, right? Presumably those who worked while the others were fighting were still having some protective gear like helmets or body armor. It's debatable. Some say that it could be lighter. There were ways in which even during assaults the same Roman legionnaires fought with lighter armor, right? So maybe during the work here, to make it quicker, there could be a combination between safety and protection and work effectiveness. I mean, that would allow the Legionnaires to work even without armor, right? We don't know about shields, pila, and other equipment. Probably they retained a sword, etc. But it's likely that they were all positioned in direction, at least of a possible attacker, wherever it could come handy, and remained readily accessible, of course, in case of need. We know in a moment between history and myth, like 350 BC, as reported by Livy 7:23, that it was the Triadi who built the trenches of the camp, while the Astati and Principes defended the position against the Gauls on that occasion. Now, it makes sense, at least considering what the structure of the Manipular Legion at that point was still incipient, whatever. Here we'll not digress on the genesis of the Manipular Legion, but the idea is that, how it would happen, possibly even later, that the Triadi, like during the 2nd century BC, were still mostly left in the camp as guard, kind of as watches, guard duties, were properly as an organic, not as a tactical, because already by the 2nd century BC, well before the Marian reform, the Legionnaires were kind of homogenizing from an equipment point of view. So the Astati and the Principes were the ones that, by duty, right, as the younger ones and the more agile ones, were to fight in the front, right? So it would be kind of normal, at least in Livy's perspective, for that still to have been the case back in the day, and the same happened, according to the same Livy, 49:37, at Pydna in 168 BC, as the work proceeded. First the Triadi, then the Principes, and finally the Astati were withdrawn in succession, sharing the work, therefore alternating the work, while the Velites and cavalry remained to protect their fellow soldiers from the Macedonian attacks, which is interesting because, as we were saying before, cavalry was and the Velites were kind of altogether a minority component of the army. It was mostly, as you know, composed by heavy infantry, but they were the ones that would engage also in these skirmishing phases, screening operations, that in that case also the Macedonians were capable of. They had a lot of Balkan skirmishers that were pretty well suited for that role, and at this point also something more also developed. As look at the Spanish campaign during the Second Punic War, that they were provided also with more effective weaponry for exalt their individualism they had in hand-to-hand combat, not just for skirmishing. So normally, yes, it could be carried out also by the allies, etc. But the function is obvious, right? In this case, you don't want to tire excessively during the encampment works all the heavy infantry, so that you make first one section work and then another in rotation, etc. And the lighter troops, the more technically flexible ones, are out there to screen the army while the works are being carried out. In all this, the centurions checked the correct execution of the works using graduated poles of 10 feet, that is around 3 meters long, called decempede. In fact, as the name says, they were 10 feet long, to verify the dimensions of the excavations. So to say, to certify that the work had been carried out precisely. And the general supervision of the wall in the Legion was entrusted to 2 tribunes, right? So that's pretty much it. And as you understand, what I try to do here is also to present why the Roman military was that effective, but how still effectiveness is not about a specific mechanism or a specific technology or a specific, whatever, but simply because, there was an organization and a commitment and a moral force behind this thing to make it work, right, for all the political, social, military reasons that made Roman civilization, that other peoples, at least as far as we know, didn't, talking especially, the comparison historiographically is with the Hellenistic warfare that is not particularly documented, but from some, for example, disciplinary norms, etc., passes as less strict than the Roman ones, right? So here the Romans were combining still that kind of, what they would have called barbarity with same civilizational capacity in creating this unique synthesis that made them what we know. Now, we will keep talking about this stuff in general, and we will see probably also some battles and engagements where these provisions literally saved properly the day for the Romans, and or maybe in their absence or in their mismanagement wouldn't, right? So that should give the proper importance to them according to the situation. For now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.